The Good, the Bad, Oxford, comma, and the Ugly is the title of the book. So this book just came about when we started thinking about what's going to happen in next year's election. And this was a couple of years ago. And what really struck us was that we were coming to an inflection point in South Africa's trajectory, where you'd had a single party dominance for 3 decades post-apartheid, and incidentally single party dominance from 1948 to 1994. So between 1948 and 2023, only 2 parties have governed South Africa. This is going to be quite a momentous change, where you're entering an era of possible coalition governments, either in this year's election and probably very likely by 2029. And it's not an instantaneous process. It'll happen in provinces, cities, and nationally. It'll probably roll out like that. But already KwaZulu-Natal looks like it's very likely heading for a coalition, provincial government, etc. So rather than just sort of carry on sort of stumbling forward, as South Africa is wont to do, we were asking, why did we just take this opportunity to try and think a bit more deeply about what's happening and what are the implications, and what are the choices that face us at this point, and what are the choices that will take us forward and the ones that will hold us back. So that was the motivation. So similar scenarios were done prior to the transition to democracy by Clem Santa. I won't pretend that we're anywhere near Clem Santa, but it's not a prediction about the future. It's basically an opportunity to think clearly about some of the choices that are faced. And it's quite interesting because if you read the Clem Santa thing, the big economic movement of the time was Japan. It was all about Japan. Japan was this rising power. It was going to be bigger. The economy was going to be bigger than the US. There's going to be a whole new Asian matrix built around Japan that was going to change the whole focus of the world. And 30 odd years later, we can see that kind of petered out, due, interestingly, to some bad policy choices, some of them in the macroeconomic space and so on. And you have the rise of China in that period to become now the major sort of rising global economy. Okay, without further ado, just take you through some of the slides here. So really just to try and build a fact-based model that outlines the consequences of choices that voters and political leaders make for the country. So just the agenda, we'll just start off, sorry, I have to go back there. There's just a few sections. I'm going to go quite quickly through this. It's available on our website, and if I talk to it too long, I can really waffle on, and I don't think you want that, or anybody wants that, but you can actually go and look at the detail on the site. So the first discipline really is to look at what we regard as being the immutable, unchangeable realities that we're facing. The first is this move from dominant party to coalition government. Okay, so you'll see that this is the votes in national elections since 1994. And you'll see that there is this kind of divide. This is basically up to the 2019 election. And the ANC is slowly on a downward trajectory since 2009. And it's not clear if that trajectory accelerates, stabilizes, and that's one of the key factors in the scenarios. I think this is a fascinating graph for me because it actually shows what's happening. So that graph that I showed you there is the bottom tiny section of this graph, okay? And that is what's happening in electoral politics. There's a massive middle section there, which, the black section, which essentially is adults, people over the age of 18, South African citizens who do not vote. Okay, that is the biggest political movement in the country by far. The people who do not vote outnumber the people who vote for the first time in 2019. So when you say that the ANC has X percentage of the vote, it doesn't necessarily give you the true picture. Or it shows that there's a diminishing participation in formal politics, which is a big dynamic in South Africa. So, and then you've got this youth that are too young to vote. So if you look at the total population, you've got to understand that formal politics is quite a small part of the total population. Okay, that dissatisfaction is high. In some countries, apathy equates to consent. In South Africa, there's with employment in the 30 and 40% range, and the social problems that we have, that's unlikely to be the case. It's likely to be disengagement. Okay, so we did do a survey, and interestingly, 78% of people said they would be happy to see a coalition govern the country. We did that in November last year, and I think this speaks to a dynamic in the society where people are saying, work together, fix the problem. Like everybody get in the same room and sort this out. The growth without investment, policies, certainty and accountable government, that goes without saying. South Africa's trajectory versus sub-Saharan Africa's trajectory. That's GDP per capita as a portion of global GDP per capita, if you understand that dynamic. So it's interesting that we were over 100% in 1960, and we're now in around 54%. Of course, that doesn't take into account of how that GDP is allocated and the inequality factor and so on. But just as a raw stat, it's quite an interesting slide. That just says the same thing in a different way. And then I think we see the kind of crime, the extreme rise in crime up through the 1980s, the rapid decline, and now an upward trajectory again. What's quite interesting is the nature of crime and the way that it's playing out. So what we're seeing is a lot more of this kind of crime. So actions by mafia-style groups, state-embedded actors, this kind of crime has more economic consequences. The skills shortage, South Africa's average maths score grade 8. We're slightly better than Morocco, which is quite sad for Morocco, I think. If you look at science, we're dead last. Okay, so this is not all countries in the world. This is countries measured in a global study. So the skills factor is massive. We spend more, what's quite interesting, on schooling as a percentage of GDP than all of those other countries. But the outcome is the worst. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the way in which public resources are being applied to push the country forward. Okay, then there's foreign policy alignment. Brenter's Foundation has a particular view on this. So I think trade with Asia and with China is large, but you have to remember that there's a negative trade balance with Asia. It's quite a significant factor. And we have a positive trade balance, most positive with Africa. So where should we be focusing if we want to try and improve our economic position? Yeah, destinations for South African exports, quite an important graph when it comes to thinking about where South Africa locates itself globally, which I think is quite a big public debate at the moment. So it's hard to say where South Africa locates itself globally because we moved very strongly in one way, on Russia and Ukraine, and then kind of have backpedaled quite a bit in the recent past. I think realizing the consequences of that and the problems that arise. But I mean, I think the view that South Africa is in a strong position to be a neutral player and should be properly non-aligned and playing off both sides against each other is probably the correct position. Okay, so how will policy play out? So this was election survey in November. We've done one subsequently. I should update this. And that ANC vote has come down to about 41% now. So it suggests that at this stage, there's likely to be a coalition government. What kind of coalition? Spread between those three options, basically. Those are the three fundamental coalition options facing the country. Biggest problem, I think we all know this: jobs, corruption, load shedding, crime, weak leadership. I'm not going to take you through all of that. It's quite interesting that there's a lot of public allocation of blame for the problem on the last 30 years of governance now, rather than on other external issues, which is quite a substantial development in our view. So this is the multi-trillion-dollar question: can we attract the investment to grow? So at the moment, we're kind of stuck a little bit. Then I think this is the real sort of problem that we have, is that there's a political logjam. South Africa recognizes what reforms it needs. It has the reform policies. The president says we're doing it in all his speeches. There's a unit in the presidency that's dedicated to making it happen. Business says we're coming to help. And yet, despite all of that, nothing happens. And there are 70 ships waiting outside Durban, and the lights are going off. So it's these structural issues in our politics. The million-dollar question is, can we fix them? So what we have, I think, is ministers disagreeing with reforms. So the president makes an announcement. The Minister of Minerals and Energy says, I'm a coal fundamentalist. Like, sorry about the renewables program that you announced in your State of the Nation address, Mr. President, but we're not doing it, And then it has to be cajoled and so on. So there's a whole lack of coherence in government and a lack of ability to make a decision and then execute, which I think is massively problematic. I think bureaucracy that's threatened by private sector competition and its implications. I think this is quite a serious thing. So when these reforms are implemented, they're implemented with a lot of problematic regulation and I think the Afrikaans expression is met lang tande. So, the civil service doesn't embrace these things and make them happen and work day and night to see it through. And finally, inadequate skills. And then also, there's a whole network of rents that exists in the society that the establishment doesn't want disrupted. A lot of people actually making billions of rands trucking coal to Richards Bay and to Eskom power stations. It's a massive industry. That industry has some political leverage and some political associations. So that's a big problem in our politics. What's been happening recently is that we've had lower load shedding, but if you look at the graphs, there are two graphs that you've got to consider, which is supply and demand. And the way that the economy is slowing down, and we had a negative quarter now, demand has gone down. Supply has also gone down. Supply of electricity is also down, but demand is down more. And so you have less load shedding. and then everyone thinks things are looking up. I think we're in an era where we have a lot more people. There's a demographic dividend in Africa. Look back to our earlier slide about Africa consuming South African exports. But we have to make it happen. We have to actually really make the most of it. So essentially there are 4 quadrants to this, on 2 axes. So less effective government, more effective government, weak economy, strong economy. So the good quadrant is obviously where you have effective government and strong economy, and how do you get there? So we have, in our view, we have a positive coalition that finally gets the momentum to do some of these reforms. With the ANC or without the ANC, depending on where it goes. If the ANC chooses to align itself with the center, then I think that would be probably give some positive momentum. If a coalition without the ANC were to come into government, they would have a strong incentive to get on with reforms. And then the opposite quadrant, where you have weak economic growth and less effective government, I think that's the nightmare scenario. I think that's where you have the ANC turning to the EFF and forming a sort of populist style, Latin American style populist government that basically abandons fiscal discipline and control, and you get nationalization and investors flee and the currency collapses and you're in Venezuela. So that's or Zimbabwe. So and then the ugly scenario, I think, is this carrying on the way we're carrying on. So it's just, we continue to stumble forward, but as you stumble forward, you stumble slower and slower and less effectively, and you slowly sink into that worst quadrant. And then just because there had to be 4 quadrants, we also went to the Clint Eastwood Library and came up with Fistful of Cents. So this is where you have a strong economy, so things are happening, you get some growth going, but it's a very rent-intensive economy, governance is low, and you have a sort of mafia-style state and a tiny elite making all of the running at the expense of the rest of the country.